Welcome back everyone to my Spider-Man review series. In today's video we're going to be reviewing 2007's Spider-Man 3, directed by Sam Raimi. This film focuses on Peter Parker a few years after the events of Spider-Man 2. Him and Mary Jane are happily together. Spider-Man has now finally earned the respect of New York City, but in the wake of this he now ends up dealing with his own ego that is building because of this love that he gets from the citizens of New York, as well as new foes in the form of Sandman, a symbiote that bonds to his suit, as well as his former best friend Harry. Now, I remember very much when this film came out in 2007 and the hype that just surrounded the entire marketing leading up to this film's release, because of course I went there to the cinema to see this film, and like I said in my Spider-Man 2 review, my memory of going to see this film in the theaters is a lot more clearer than what it was for Spider-Man 2. I remember being so pumped going into the release. I remember when I was seeing all the posters, and especially when they showed the posters of the black suit. And my thoughts on this film really have gone up and down over the 14 years since this film's release, because when I first watched it when I was young, when I came out of the theaters as the 7-year-old who was buzzing to see this film in the cinemas, I enjoyed it. I did enjoy it. I did think at the time that it was probably my least favourite out of the three, but I still really enjoyed the film. Then as we kind of got into, I'd say, the early 2010s, kind of around about the same time period where all of a sudden everyone just started to have this hate for just very specific films from like a certain generation, namely the Star Wars prequels and Spider-Man 3, when all of a sudden those films went from being films that people watched at release and thought, yeah, they were good, to the point where all of a sudden it was like the thing to trash on online, it was the thing to hate, to have a really negative opinion about. I unfortunately did get sucked into that camp of that mindset. I all of a sudden went to this guy who was just like, yeah, I hate this film, I don't enjoy it, it's really bad, it's got too many villains, emo Peter Parker dancing in the street, what is this? And then I've noticed that over the last, I'd say, 4 years or so, the reception to this film has slowly turned back, and a lot of people are really starting to appreciate this movie a lot more. And I would say for me, the first time I really went from not liking Spider-Man 3 in that phase to really appreciating it was when I rewatched it in prep for Spider-Man Homecoming, when I rewatched all the Spider-Man films. And I actually remember watching it and saying to myself, do you know what, this is actually a lot better than I initially thought. And then every time I have watched it since then, this film gets better and better. Now, it does have problems. I still agree definitely that it's the worst film in the trilogy, but I definitely think this film is far better than what some people are actually willing to give it credit for. So starting off with the positives for Spider-Man 3, one angle that this movie takes with the story that I really like is exploring Peter's happiness at him finally being able to embrace the fact that New York City loves Spider-Man, but also kind of the arrogance and the ego that kind of seeps out from him because of this. Peter doesn't knowingly act like this. It all very much comes out of by accident or coincidence, and particularly in circumstances where kind of Mary Jane is getting the treatment that Peter got in Spider-Man 2, where nothing's going her way, everything seems to be going against her. But because Peter is in this place now where Spider-Man is revered by New York citizens, and he's now kind of the face of heroism, because of that, he kind of finds it a bit harder to sympathize and help Mary Jane in that scenario, because he's on the opposite end of the spectrum. That was just a really cool place to see Peter as a character, and just seeing that different side to him where he is that arrogance. And I really like that, because not only does it really show dimensions to his character and show how Spider-Man has almost in a way affected him in a bad way in terms of his aspects of looking at people as Peter Parker, it also really sets the seeds for him when he eventually gets the black symbiote suit, and of course that amplifies that arrogance and that ego that's starting to build up inside of him. And the theme of forgiveness as well in this one, Peter learning to forgive himself for his actions in the black symbiote suit, to forgive Sandman for being the one who killed Uncle Ben, which is retconned in this film, where Sandman was the killer of Uncle Ben and not some random criminal. Sandman learning to forgive himself for being the one who killed Uncle Ben, Mary Jane forgiving Peter. All of these things and all these themes of forgiveness and how they are not only set up and how they are explored throughout the film and how they come to a conclusion in the final act, it's all just really quintessential Raimi, and he does it in a way that's very kind of operatic, very grandiose, but just has such an immense payoff when you get to the final act. And never is that more satisfying for me personally than with the relationship between Harry and Peter. Seeing these two characters who at the start of the film are basically out to try and beat up one another as much as they can, especially from Harry's perspective towards Peter, and how that completely changes throughout the film with the events that happened, to the point where you get to the final act and Harry and Peter end up teaming up to save MJ, and that results in Harry's death. It's so emotional, and once again, the theme of forgiveness. Peter and Harry finally forgive each other for all the things they've done to each other, and that was just, again, the kind of moments and writing that I just don't think people are willing to give this film credit for. The villains as well in this one, at least 2 out of the 3, I actually do really like. I like Sandman in this one. I think Thomas Hayden Church gives a really good performance in the role of Sandman. I really love his birth sequence. It's one of my favourite scenes in the whole film. The visual effects and the score really just help to sell you on how downbeat this guy is, of course, with the situation with him trying to help his daughter who's dying. And he really is kind of like essential crook with a heart of gold, and I like how the film explores that. I do wish he was in the movie a bit more. There's a segment, especially in the second act of the film, where he's basically off screen for a decent half an hour, which is a big shame. I really would have liked to have seen him being the main focus of the film. Of course, that is what Sam Raimi wanted, but didn't get because of Avi Arad and his obsession with Venom. But I do really like Sandman, and I think as a visual villain, he's really, really interesting. But what they're able to do with him as an actual character, I think was just as good. And the other one being Harry, of course, because this is the villain that we've been building towards for 2 films. We've seen him go from Peter's best friend to this guy who hates Spider-Man, then realizing that those 2 are the same, and how that flips his perspective on everything completely. And you see him in the way he is in this film, and just his character journey, except for a few bits which I will mention in the negatives. For the most part, by the time we get to the conclusion of it, I think is a really good arc for him as a character. The way that they tie up his relationship with Peter and MJ, and just him as a threat in the film, I really enjoyed. And I love how James Franco basically hams it up in this film, especially in a few scenes. When I watched it in the early 2010s, I was like, oh, that's awful. Looking back at it now, I'm just like, do you know what? He was playing it up. Sam Raimi probably told him to do so, and do you know what? I love him for it, because it makes his scenes just even more special and just way more memorable. Just maybe not for all of the right reasons. The action in this one as well, I actually do think is very, very good. There's a lot of really cool action sequences. I really like the final battle, how they kind of visualize that Spider-Man is fighting the dark reflection of himself. Cool, and how the fight plays out is really interesting. Really, any of the action sequences with Venom are really cool from a visual standpoint, and I actually don't mind Venom visually. It's kind of more character-wise, the person who inherits Venom in the final act, that I'm not too keen on, and again, I will address in the negatives. But the action in the film is just really good. I love the fight between Peter and Sandman in the subway. That's really cool. I love the fight between Peter and Harry in the mansion, and even the little heist with Sandman, which Peter has to come in and stop when he first encounters him. That's a pretty cool sequence as well. I do quite enjoy that. They are very good sequences. I don't think they're quite as good as they are in Spider-Man 2, but I still very much enjoy them, and they really do help to kind of break up the film. And again, they're kind of filmed in Raimi's unique style and his trademark quips that he has with action sequences, which just make it really visually interesting to watch. I also will say as well, this is the best looking film visually in terms of the way that everything is shot, and the cinematography I think is really good in this one. You can definitely tell that they really upgraded it in that regard. It's definitely the most flashiest and the most colourful out of the 3. Christopher Young's music as well, I also really like. Of course, Danny Elfman doesn't return for this one, but the use of his themes throughout is really good, and all the new music that Chris composes, especially the themes for the villains and the symbiote theme in particular, I really enjoy. Kind of like digs a lot into almost his score that he did for the Hellraiser series, but twists it up enough to make it really, really engrossing and quite tense and frightening in certain places, especially with the Venom soundtrack, which is probably why it's my favourite one. But his score throughout the film, very, very good. Kind of has his own unique spin on it, but keeps enough of the Elfman score that you can definitely tell it feels like a Spider-Man score. It doesn't feel like a generic superhero film soundtrack. And of course, I have to mention the Bully Maguire memes. I mean, this film gave birth to one of the best ongoing memes I've ever seen on the internet. Every time that like Bully Maguire gets mentioned and all of that stuff, it does make me laugh, and I have to give this film credit for that. The fact that, you know, it just came up with all these things that are just so enjoyable and so funny. And the thing is that like the whole thing about when Peter gets the black symbiote and it enhances his negative personality traits, a lot of people kind of mention this as like the movie's biggest downfall. I've never been one of those people that hates the emo Peter Parker. I actually really like it. It's intentionally done in a way where Peter thinks he's cool when he's doing all of this stuff, but because he's a nerd, he doesn't know how to embrace it properly, so he looks like an absolute fool to everyone. That was the whole point of the sequence. It's supposed to be like that. I just don't think audiences really understood that for the longest time, but I think now people are actually starting to realize what Raimi was going for. I love all the sequences. The bit where he's doing the finger guns as he's walking down the street, and then the bit in the jazz bar. And I just love the way that Tobey Maguire just puts all the lines.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye. Stings, doesn't it?
I just love the whole emo Peter Parker. It is good. I get what Raimi was going for, and it works. And I'll say as well, this film also still retains a lot of the emotional moments from the original 2 movies. It's not like those things are completely thrown out the window. You can tell that they're still there. A lot of them still land or are still as impactful as they were in the first 2 films, which I do respect, and I kind of feel like a lot of people just try to pretend doesn't exist in this film. There are quite a few emotional moments, like I say, the birth of Sandman, the scene where Peter accidentally hits MJ and his realization that his anger's taking over, the death of Harry. There are a lot of really good emotional moments in the film. I just don't think people realize that they do exist here. Now, as for the negatives, I don't really want to beat on these things too hard, because essentially a lot of them are the things that you will have heard a lot of other people say about this film. I'm going to get the most obvious one out of the way to begin with. There's simply too much going on in this film. There's way too many stories and way too many villains. You've got 3 villains. As I mentioned earlier, my favorite 2 were by far Harry and the Sandman. Even though realistically, Sandman out of the 3 is the one you could probably cut the easiest, but because he's the most visually interesting one and he adds so much to Peter as a character, Venom ends up being the villain that I like the least. Because even though I enjoyed all the stuff with the whole black symbiote thing, as soon as the suit comes off Peter and it goes on to Eddie Brock, it is so incredibly rushed. And the character of Eddie Brock as well, I just do not like. Topher Grace, he does what he can, but it's the whole direction that he's given, the way that he's so camp with everything, it takes it too far. I don't mind Venom when he's like all the CGI Venom in the final act and he's battling Peter. It's just whenever they peel it back and they show Topher Grace's face as it, no, that's not Venom. I just don't like it. And especially with a character like Eddie Brock and how Venom is in the comics, I just didn't like the way they translated it to the big screen. You could tell that Raimi wasn't as confident with him as a character, and if you read any of the behind-the-scenes stuff, Avi Arad saying to Raimi, you have to include Venom. They had to do it, so they made a compromise. He included his own villain in Sandman, but also the studio's choice in Venom. And so that's what we end up with here, with these villains who are like the main villain for their own segment, and then they get written out of the film for a long amount of time because of some really contrived reason. Like, we start off with Harry, and then he gets amnesia for no reason, which adds nothing to his character, so that we can have Sandman be the main villain, and then Sandman gets knocked out, so that then we can have Harry kind of being the main villain whilst Peter in the Black Symbiote is doing all this villainous stuff, and then Harry gets taken out, and then Sandman resurfaces, and then the Black Symbiote suit goes off Peter, and then goes on to Eddie, so he becomes Venom, and Sandman and Venom become the villains for the final act of the film. It's all over the place. You could just tell there's just the way they had to constantly write these villains out. It got so boring so quickly. And then you've got all the other stuff, like you have Gwen Stacy thrown into the mix, which never made sense to me personally, and how that kind of adds to all this like love triangle stuff between Peter and Mary Jane and all the complications there. It didn't need to be there. I feel like at the end of Spider-Man 2, with them finally being together, we didn't need to go through all of this relationship turmoil of will they, won't they? And then you throw all the thing with MJ kissing Harry. I just wasn't a fan of that either. It just kind of felt like it got tiring. We got to that point at the end of Spider-Man 2. Why do we have to go through this again? And the last thing I'll say as well is that the CGI in this one, it gets way too overused, especially in the fight sequences. There's numerous ones where the one that I think of the most is the first fight between Harry and Peter. There's a really shoddy bit where Harry is chasing Peter with the glider, and you can so clearly tell that it's all green screen behind him. There's also a lot of use of CGI doubles, which it's not too bad at the end of the film, but especially in the first fight, it's not very good. You can so clearly tell that CGI faces and CGI bodies, it just doesn't work for me personally. It does unfortunately detract from a few aspects when watching the fight scenes in particular. But other than those few things, I still do really enjoy Spider-Man 3. I certainly think that it's a film that has been given a lot of unnecessary hate over the years. It certainly has issues, as I've mentioned there. It is a film that is trying to do a lot, and unfortunately doesn't quite do everything to a high level. But I still very much enjoy this film. This is a film that I can very, very comfortably put on and watch and really enjoy. It still feels Raimi, even though there is a lot going on. I still think that the themes and the story of the whole film does work for the most part, especially from the side of Peter and what they do with Peter in the film. I enjoy Sandman and Harry as villains. I really enjoy the action for the most part. I love the music. I love this darker side to Peter that we explore in the film, and it does make for a film that I do rewatch and do really enjoy. And I certainly don't think it's the godforsaken, awful movie that a lot of people proclaim it to be. I actually do really enjoy this film, and I will defend it until the day I die. I really do think this film is very unnecessarily hated and slept on, and I think you should give it a rewatch, because I think now a lot of us have grown up since we first watched the film. I think there's a lot more to take from it and a lot more to enjoy about it than we may have thought originally. So for that reason, you can absolutely feel free to shoot me down if you disagree with this score. I'm going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. I really do enjoy this film. Again, it has problems, hence why I've not given it anything like a 9 or a 9.5, which is what I gave to the original Spider-Man film. This film has problems, but I still really enjoy it, and I had a really good time with it, and I still think there's a lot here, a lot of merit that people just don't give this film credit for. And once again, I will happily defend this film because I love it. It feels Sam Raimi, and I still think this is a good conclusion to the Spider-Man trilogy, although I will say, I still do wish we got that Spider-Man 4. Please, Sony, give us Spider-Man 4. But thank you all very much for watching my review of Spider-Man 3. I'll be very interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this film, so please make sure you leave a like on the video and let me know your thoughts on Spider-Man 3 down below in the comments section. Feel free to shoot me down if you are one of the people that hates this movie with a passion. I'll be very interested to hear your opinions on that regard. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well if you enjoy what you see and you want to see more and you want to continue on with my review for the rest of the Spider-Man live action films. And with that being said, I'll hope to see you all again for the next installment with my review of 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. See you then.